Hi there, welcome to the screencast for Chapter 3 on the art of quoting, which I call Metaphor Central, and you'll understand that momentarily. To convey what they say, you need to write the arguments of others into your text, which we've already talked about. So you can do this by summary, as Chapter 2 discussed, or by quoting, which is what Chapter 3 is all about. So, quoting gives credibility to your summary. It helps you ensure that it's fair and accurate. But we have to be careful because some people quote too little because they don't want to bother going back and finding the quotes. Some people quote too much because they're short on commentary or because they lack understanding of the quotes, so they can't comment on it. But the biggest problem that we have is not connecting our quotes to our point. We assume that the quotes speak for themselves, and then we don't make the connections, the elaborations, the going beyond what the quote already says. Even just paraphrasing it is no good unless you have a point to make about it. So, our big concern here is having to do with two things: dropped quotes, which you're already familiar with, not integrating it into a sentence. But also, we want to consider not properly integrated ones that fall under this problem. So, we have our first metaphor of quotations being like orphans. They've been taken away from their contexts, the source that they were originally in. They have to be integrated into their new surroundings. So, they were in a loving home for whatever reason. The piece that they were in could not take care of them anymore. They were taken out of it. The reason's not important, but the fact is they've been living in an orphanage for a while. You've highlighted them. And they've been waiting to be welcomed lovingly into their new home. When you decide to put them into your own writing, consider in the metaphor that they got adopted. However, what's going to happen to an orphan if you just drop him or her into a new home without any support? They're going to have no connection to their past. They're going to have no connection to their future. They have no sense of purpose. You've got sad, confused, lonely little orphan quotes. You have to make sure to give them the support that they need to be adequately integrated into their new families. So there's two ways that you can make these orphans productive members of your new society. You can choose quotes wisely, and have a reason for using them. And you can and should surround every quotation with a frame that explains whose words they are, what the quotation means, and how it relates to your text. Because remember, quoting what they say always has to be connected to what you say. So, step one, choosing meaningful passages. First of all, you have to know why you're using it. Make them meaningful, not just because they're required. Choose something that's powerful because of how the author states it, something that paraphrasing wouldn't do justice. They have to be relevant and meaningful, and you have to have a reason for saying it as a quote instead of a paraphrase. Also recognize that as your text develops, your quotes might change. So you have to think of finding quotes and developing your idea as one integrated step, not two different ones, because they work together. So another metaphor that you could use is to build a frame around every quotation. You want to present them in a way that makes their relevance clear. The biggest way to go wrong with this is what the book calls hit and run quotes. So a hit and run quote is one that we put into our essay and then we run away from it. Now, this might be known as a dropped quote. Dropped quotes are a grammatical thing, and you might have heard other terms for them, but it's also a matter of running away from it, meaning not addressing it, not doing anything with it once you put it in. It's like you don't care about it enough to even stop and find out what it's doing there or what's happened to it. So here's an example of a hit and run quote. Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting. Quote, Fiji is just one example. Until television was introduced, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs, blah, 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 blah. I think Bordeaux is right. Another point Bordeaux makes is, etc. So, a couple of things going on here. The writer doesn't introduce the quote or explain why he finds it important. He doesn't explain who Bordeaux is or even that the words are hers. So, we've got a dropped quote here, too. Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting, doesn't tell us anything at all about the context or what Susan Bordeaux's actual point is. We see no connection between Susan Bordeaux and where this quote came from, the quote, and then when we get down here, the author's run away from it. He hits it and then he runs on to his next point. So speaking of zooming on to a next point, here's another metaphor, and this is by far my favorite. You probably already have heard quote integration described as making a quotation sandwich or a hamburger quote. I prefer this little chicken sandwich. So when we're thinking of it as a sandwich, the top bun is the lead-in claim. It explains who's speaking and it sets up the quote. It should accurately reflect the spirit of the passage, but it's important to think that you have to do more than just mention the name and qualifications of the person who said it. You've got to provide some context. So in this example, I'm explaining not only who said it, but who he is, the context of the argument, a paraphrase of his main idea, etc. All of this is several sentences happening before I even get to my quote. Then, of course, the meat and pickles, the important stuff, is the quote itself. We've already led in with the phrase. It's only alone on this slide because I introed it in the previous slide. So, as Elbow puts it, this step is vital to interacting with sources correctly in order to represent them accurately. And then the follow-up. The follow-up is the most important part. It shows that you know why it's important, what you take it to say, what you have to say about it, in short, what it's doing in your essay. This is where you're elaborating, where you're making your connections, etc. And we'll talk more about bottom bun in a second, but notice that it's also more than just one sentence. If you're doing this correctly, you're putting some thought and effort and giving these quotes the attention they deserve. So let's look at an example of a well-sandwiched quote. I'm going to leave this up here on the screen. I'm going to ask you to pause the video for a second. I'm not going to read it out loud because this video is going to get pretty long. Pause the screen and read this this example, and I want you to look for two things. The parts of the sandwich. What's the top bun? What's the middle meat and pickles? What's the bottom bun? And also, what is the template-like language that indicates that they say, I say, and precise signal verbs? Pause the video now and start again after you've thought about those two things. Okay, so first of all, we've got different parts of our bun. What we have up here, notice it's like 3 sentences, tells us what her basic argument is, what she's trying to say. It introduces this quote. Then we've got the quote itself, what she says. Notice this is the same quote that was used badly a couple of examples ago. And then we have a couple sentences of elaboration. And then that's even followed up with your I say. All right. This is an example of a really well sandwiched quote, and I want you to return to this as you are working through your own essays. This is a really good mentor text for sort of the degree to which quotes should be integrated into what you're doing. But now the other thing I asked you to look for was the templates and the signal verbs. So here I've highlighted the parts of this that are telling us who's speaking, whose point is what. Notice that every single sentence has some sort of voice marker indicator to let us know who is speaking and why it's here. So this is an example of a good quote integration because the framing helps to integrate the quote, absolutely, to prevent it from being dropped, but it also leads to the I say. It demonstrates the writer's interpretation of Bordeaux. It shows that the quote has been used meaningfully to set up the writer's own argument. And finally, a last word here kind of about the bottom bun. The follow-up sentences don't repeat word for word. Right? There's some repetition, but the bottom bun doesn't only restate what Bordeaux already said. Her reference to 62% of Fijian girls is no longer an inert statistic, but now it's a quantitative example of how the West's obsession with dieting is spreading across the globe. It always comes back to your interpretation and your point. All right. There's no hard and fast rules about how much to elaborate. It's better to risk being overly explicit as long as what you're doing furthers your point. Remember, you're trying to create a hybrid text between what the original source had to say, where the conversation is, and how you're joining in. The audience always needs to see how you interpret the text, because quotes do not speak for themselves. They can be interpreted differently to support different agendas. And that is your goal in using quotes. Show how this quote fits into your agenda. Thank you for watching Screencast for chapter number 3 on the art of quoting.